Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to be back in North Carolina. As mentioned, I went to graduate school there in the field of history many, many decades ago. But I've lived in North Carolina and I always love to come back. You can go home again, so I'm delighted to be home again. But I did not come here today to reminisce about bygone days in Carolina. I'm here because I'm worried about future days in Carolina and worried about future days in America generally. We face, I believe, a very grave threat to our democracy, namely our failure to ensure a news and information ecosystem that is adequate to the needs of our citizens, adequate to the needs of our democratic dialogue, and adequate to our ability to govern ourselves. And as I see it, there are few public policy issues as pressing as the sad state of our media. And I know that's making quite a big claim, but I just ask you to hear me out for a few minutes on this one, and then we can talk about it in the discussion period. Media, as some of you know, has long been my passion. When I went to the FCC as a commissioner back in 2001, I found a huge push on at that time to encourage more consolidation in our media so that a few huge media conglomerates could take over more and more of the smaller independent broadcasters around the country. And that encouragement came really from two places. It came from the private sector, but it also came from the public sector, specifically the Federal Communications Commission, where I went to serve. And I suspected right off the bat that that was not a great combination that would exact a heavy toll on local broadcasting, on local and national news, on diversity, both diversity of viewpoint and diversity of ownership, and on the public interest generally. And this isn't just about abstract numbers about how many outlets one big media company can own. It's more fundamental than that. It's about fundamental changes to media companies who are charged with informing the nation and nourishing our civic dialogue in return for their free use of the public airways. There's not a company in the United States or business that owns an airway. Airways belong to you, they belong to me. We went through a period of really extensive hyper-speculation over the last 20 years with this buying up of companies and a few huge media companies becoming stronger and stronger. But I don't blame just the private sector or even primarily the private sector for the runaway consolidation we experienced. I blame even more, I think, a compliant Federal Communications Commission that seldom met a merger that it didn't like, seldom met a merger that it wouldn't bless, and then to make matters even worse, eviscerated most of the public interest oversight, public interest guidelines that we had for the media under our jurisdiction to make sure that those media were serving the public interest and informing our people. So now our challenge is to get the policy right now, to prevent further damage to our democracy, and then to roll back some of these rules that have already inflicted such damage on our media landscape. Traditional journalism, and by that I mean newspapers, radio, television, has, in my mind, incurred life-threatening injury, not just because of the coming of the internet, not really even primarily because of the coming of the internet. It began long before that. It was born of this generation of hyper-speculation, where the bottom line of the quarterly report was allowed and encouraged to trump the public interest, compounded by that 30 years of public apathy, and apathy that continues this day, in its failure to exercise even minimal public interest oversight over it. And broadcast journalism has not been the same craft since. You know, the facts are brutal. We've got thousands of journalists, and I don't know the exact number because it's hard to find out, but I suspect it's 20, 25, 30,000 people who used to be journalists who have lost their jobs. And instead of walking their beats now in search of a story, they're walking the streets in search of a job. So think how much better off our journalism would be if those 20 or 25 or 30,000 people were back on the job. That was a heavy, heavy price to pay for all of the consolidation and deregulation that we went to. But you know, we were always told, well, this merger is really good. You're going to have all these efficiencies and economies of scale, and it's going to lead to an even better environment. But then, lo and behold, as soon as the merger was consummated, and they paused to figure out how they were going to pay back all the financing and meet all the financing obligations of the merger and the guidelines, they looked around for places to cut, and the first place to cut, unfortunately, was too often the newsroom. So journalists got the axe, and glitzy infotainment replaced real in-depth investigative reporting, and opinion journalism displaced real investigative journalism. Spin substituted for substance, and thousands of stories that might have held the powerful accountable went unreported and went really even unknown. And consolidation continues to this day. And I remember each time one of those media moguls would come through the FCC seeking approval for their most recent deal, I was told, oh, this is the last time we'll be buying, this is the last deal we're going to do, this is all we need to do and compete. And of course, they left the office, and the waiting room was the other company saying, well, if you're going to let them get bigger, you got to let us get bigger too. And a year or two later, the first company was back, and it was just an ugly, ugly spiral. There was always more, and that's why we have TV duopolies and cable mergers and big guys buying up little guys, and big telecom companies at the same time were busy consolidating broadband, which I think is a story that you know here in North Carolina better than a lot of other states. I was really shocked to read the other day that in terms of broadband penetration, North Carolina was right down there with Mississippi, kind of at the bottom of the pack, and you really stop to think, how do we get our jobs back? How do we create opportunity? How do we educate our kids if we're dead end or dead last or close to dead last on that scale of broadband rankings? But these deals work swell for some of the big companies, not so much for the reporters, but look at the Comcast-NBCU merger, and I was the only commissioner to vote against that deal back in 2011, I guess it was. It worked pretty well for them, because just last week they were able to announce, well, we're going to buy the other 49% of NBC Universal that General Electric still holds. We've made enough money to do that right now, years before most of the savants on Wall Street thought that would be that would happen. So that's the tale of why these deals happen: to corner the market, to enrich the shareholder. Don't worry about stakeholders, and you're as much of a stakeholder as any shareholder is, but we've kind of lost that kind of capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, I think. And it's really too bad on the Comcast case. Maybe some of those profits that they amassed so quickly over those 2 years that enabled them to buy the other 49%. It would have been nice if maybe they'd reduce cable rates a little bit for folks in North Carolina who have seen their cable bills go through the roof. You know, if you look at how cable rates have gone up over the last 20 years, it's magnitudes of order greater with the rate of inflation or the cost of living. But this isn't really about consumers, is it? I don't think so. And what's next up? Who knows? But I'm sure you're reading the same reports I'm reading, that maybe Rupert Murdoch is casting his eyes on the Tribune Company to take that over. Includes the Los Angeles Times, so you have New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, lots of places in between. And it's not just that kind of outright consolidation. There's a lot of clever devices that are being used now to achieve de facto consolidation. The licenses might not change, but you have joint operating agreements and shared services contracts and all the rest to get around the media ownership rules. So it's a sad story of private sector hyper-speculation and public sector evisceration of the public interest and being absent without leave from doing what needs to be done. And I know that we've had, someone will say, well, what can you do about it? We've had all of this consolidation in every sector of the American economy. And by and large, that's true, but my point is that its consequences here are especially pernicious and really dangerous and damaging for the public interest, more so than what has happened in those other sectors, but here, because here it goes to the very bloodstream and the very heart of what democracy is all about, and nourishing a civic dialogue that is adequate for the people so that we as citizens can make intelligent decisions for the future of our country, which has some very steep problems to overcome. And one other thought I would just make quickly, one of the really terrible consequences of all of this consolidation that we have been through is the crowding out of diversity ownership of stations, of female ownership, of minority ownership. Here we are in a country that is now about 1/3 minority. It will be a racial, the minorities will be the majority by the middle of the century. Racial minorities own, listen to this, 2.2%. 2.2% of full power commercial television stations in this country. So is it any wonder the figures for female ownership and other diversity groups is marginally better, but it's all single digits, way down in single digits. So should we be surprised then that diversity groups don't get the coverage they need, or minority communities, you don't hear about their positive contributions, or when you do see minority or diversity populations on TV that's in caricature or in stereotype, and how many of the people that conduct the Sunday morning news shows are people of color. And to me, you're never going to have diversity of viewpoint in our media until you have more diversity in ownership. It's something that we really need to face up to, and it's something that even the current Federal Communications Commission, which I thought was going to be much different, and is different on some issues. When it comes to these issues of doing something to enhance female and diversity ownership, its record is just about zip. Often about this time, and in my remarks, someone will say, well, why all this talk about traditional media? And then Cop's guy, he looks like an old timer anyhow, and he's talking about newspapers and television and cable, and why worry about those relics when now we have broadband and the internet, new media. The internet's going to provide all the news and information that our democracy requires, right? And don't get me wrong, I love the internet. There's wonderful innovation and entrepreneurship and experimentation going on there. Barriers to entry are low, everyone can speak. Events that were never before coverable can now be flashed around the country and around the world in milliseconds. All true, but it's also true that no one so far has figured out a model for the kind of investigative journalism that we've lost in traditional media, for that kind of model to really thrive on the internet. Yes, you have the Huffington Post, you have some other places, but 90 or 95% of the news that we read, even on the internet, comes from traditional journalism. It still comes from the newspaper newsroom. It still comes from the broadcast newsroom. It's just that there's so much less of it. And to make matters worse, I think, if you look at the history of communication systems and media, from motion pictures through newspapers and radio and television, they all go down this road toward more consolidation of trying to corner the market. Owners try to set themselves up as toll booth operators or gatekeepers, and that becomes their first goal rather than democratizing the spread of information. And you can read a wonderful book by Tim Wu, some of you probably know who he is, called The Master Switch, and learn about that. And don't get me wrong, I understand the quest for market control is in the drinking water of free enterprise. It's in the drinking water of capitalism. That's the way it is, as my old friend Walter Cronkite would have said if he's still around. And that's not going to change. And now we see that happening in broadband. We've seen it certainly happening in the big telecom providers, for you, AT&T and Verizon and cable, big cable, tying up access to broadband or charging ridiculous amounts of money for rather paltry broadband service in much of the country, especially compared to what other countries are doing. And you stop and think what a tragedy it would be, really, if you took this wonderful technology of broadband, which is probably the most formative communications technology since the printing press, or maybe even including the printing press, so full of potential to create opportunity for every American, capable of really, if we get it right, providing kind of a new town square of democracy paved with broadband bricks and all that. But there's no guarantee that it's going that way, and to me it looks more and more like it's going down the same road of consolidation. Most of the news sites and the internet controlled by the local, not local media, but the big media conglomerates. That's where you go to read that news. So here you take this awesome potential, broadband and internet, and it might end up as a cableized internet. And what a tragedy that would be, to take a technology of such promise and such potential and really improve our lives. That would be a golden era of communications that we're living in, or at least moving toward. And it looks like we might be moving in the other direction, whether its potential is so broad. Yet we're way back in the pack. When I went to the FCC in 2001, we were maybe number 1 or 2 or 3 in the world in terms of broadband penetration. Now we're 16th or 20th or 24th, and you can argue about who's got the best ratings. It's not where your country and my country should be, no matter if it's 12, 15, or 20th, if we're going to dig ourselves out of the hole we're in. But the big broadband providers aren't getting the job done, and they won't even let others help. They won't even let communities help themselves. And you know that story here in North Carolina with municipal broadband. Big companies they don't want to go into some of these places because they can't really cherry pick, and it's maybe not quite as affluent a market as another one they could service down the road, 30 miles away. So cities like Wilson, North Carolina, bypassed by the big companies. You think the companies would say, well, okay, we're not going to go with somebody else, and that's not what they do. They fix it so nobody else can go in there either, and maybe they'll circle back at another time when the prospect for profits is a little bit greater. So North Carolina and some 18 other states have now passed laws prohibiting municipalities from doing what Wilson did, which was to build its own community broadband systems. And there's some real success stories around the United States. We've got about 100 or 105, something like that, to municipal broadband systems Chattanooga, Lafayette, Louisiana, several others. But you're not going to see that replicated when you have these laws being passed to preclude it. And Todd of Law, where's Todd? Todd's standing back there. He's our program director at Common Cause of our Media and Democracy Reform Program. Also a North Carolinian who wrote his doctoral dissertation actually on what happened in Wilson, North Carolina, and has since put those in some very readable non-dissertation language and some articles that you all should take a look at on the Common Cause website. But why would North Carolina, home of the research triangle, sentence its citizens to life in the slow lane of the information highway? It's really beyond me. Well, really it's not, because the reason is the unchecked power of corporations to influence policymaking and policymakers through their sheer huge pile of resources and through front organizations that will do their bidding. Some of you have maybe heard of the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, as it is called. This is a group that's been working for 25 or 30 or more years. I thought I was a pretty well-informed fellow working in Washington, D.C. for on Capitol Hill for years, and then in the Clinton administration at the FCC. I never heard of ALEC. The media never wrote the story. I never heard about ALEC until a couple of years ago. But thanks to Common Cause, Center for Media and Democracy, and some other groups, they have now shown the spotlight, focused the spotlight on ALEC. ALEC is a group heavily funded by some special interest groups who drafts laws. And they draft laws not just in telecommunications, but in voter ID laws and all, across the whole gamut, special interest laws, broadband, which I already talked about. And then they invite legislators to come to a nice conference somewhere and say, here's a whole set of laws you might be interested in introducing when you go back to the state capitol. And a lot of times the legislators will say, oh, thank you very much, appreciate your having me down here. Yeah, I'll take that back. And maybe they'll change a comma or something and introduce the law, and the next thing you know, it's passed. And all this damage has been done in telecommunications in 19 states. Now Georgia's on tap possibly to be the 20th state to preclude the kind of municipal broadband I talked about. There's no reason that we shouldn't have known about that long ago. There's no reason media shouldn't have covered that. But how much media is in state capitol offices and legislators' offices right now? How many are over right here in the Capitol at this minute? Covering the beat that maybe 10 years ago they had a bunch of reporters. Now there's probably 40 times more lobbyists than there ever were journalists. And it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better. Same thing in Washington, D.C. We have 20, last time I looked, there were 26 states that did not have an accredited reporter on Capitol Hill. How do you hold powerful accountable when you're not even covering it? And I talked to many senators who said, when I first got here 20 years ago, press conference, there's 6, 7 people from back home who were covering me. Now there's nobody. It's not the kind of accountability journalism that we need. So what I'm really talking about is a kind of investigative journalism. I can tell you a story where people are really devoted to getting to the facts. Many of you will recognize the name of Bill Paley. He used to be the big media mogul at CBS. But he also believed in the news, and he was old enough and close enough to recognize that in return for licenses for broadcast companies, that they were expected to protect the public interest, convenience, and necessity. So one day he gathered all of his reporters in a room that was probably this big, maybe filled with this many or more people. And he said, I want you folks to go and cover the news. I do not want you to worry about the cost. I've got Jack Benny. Jack Benny will raise the money, other people raise the money. It's not your job. Go cover the news. Now, how many of the media moguls of today, Les Moonves or many of these others, you think you're going to get in the room and tell the reporters to do that? Not many. So that's what we got to have. We got to have that broadcast station, the newspaper can say, you're an investigative reporter, take 6 months and go get this story. You don't have to worry about writing a blog or doing 7 other stories every day or go on TV. Get to the bottom of this story or this corruption or whatever it is. That's what's so sorely missing right now. And that's what we have to, as a nation, face up to. So what do? Well, we could spend the whole afternoon talking about what we do. Here's just a couple of things we could do. One is to begin reasserting the public interest over the special interests. I've spent more than 40 years now in Washington, D.C., and I can say with total confidence that the power of money in our nation's capital is greater, much greater now than it was back in 1970 when I went there. And as someone who once studied history up at Chapel Hill and taught it for a while, I'm also confident saying I don't know of any period in American history, including those notorious years of the Gilded Age, where money played a bigger role than money plays right now. Money buys elections, money opens doors, money gerrymanders districts, and money, as we have already talked about, often writes the laws that Congress and state legislators and city councils pass. Most of the time it does so anonymously, with no accountability, constrained by neither good laws nor a sufficiently inquisitive fourth estate. Take as one example all those political ads that we were all bombarded with for the last year or two leading up to the 2012 elections. Who really sponsors those ads? Here's an ad brought to you by Citizens for Purple Mountain Majesties and Amber Ways of Grain. Isn't that wonderful? That sounds like a great patriotic group. Would people view that ad differently if they knew it was really sponsored by a chemical company and was dumping sludge into the Great Lakes or the Chesapeake Bay or refusing to clean up a toxic dump? I think it would. And we all know the infamous Citizens United decision opened up the spigots to just about every kind of money you can think of, PAC and super PAC and billionaire and corporate and special interest and dark money and all the rest. And we don't require, Congress doesn't require full disclosure of that. But after I was at the FCC for a while and got to know a little bit more about Telecommunications Act, going through it, I happened a few years ago on Section 317, which has to do with sponsorship identification. This is authority that was conferred years and years ago, way back in the beginnings of Telecommunications Act back in the 1930s. And it applies not just to identifying commercial sponsors, it applies to political ads also. And the committee wrote rules, the commission rather, wrote rules making it very clear that people have a right to know by whom they are being persuaded, a right to know who is trying to win their vote or buy their vote or whatever. So the bad news is that was never really enforced. The good news is that the authority is there today. So we all are pretty much the opinion that Congress isn't going to blaze any great new trails in the next year or two on campaign finance reform, right? Or perhaps even pass a disclosure law, although one did pass, couldn't get through the 60-vote block in the Senate, actually passed the House, but without really strong leadership, it's not going to happen. But the point is, we don't need a new law. We don't have to wait for a new law. We don't have to wait for the president to submit his campaign disclosure suggestions. We can do this now. The FCC can do it now. The rules were last modified or fleshed out really in probably the 60s, the last time they were revisited. So since then, a lot has happened with PACs and super PACs and all that, so we need to update the rules a little bit. We can do that in 90 or 120 days, just with a simple notice and comment procedure from the FCC. 3 votes, and you'd have this done. And it doesn't solve all the money problems of campaign finance by any stretch of the imagination, but it'd be a big step forward if viewers and consumers and citizens would know who was sponsoring these ads. So I really hope that that's going to happen. But the commission is not going that way. I brought this up with the chairman starting almost 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and nothing really has happened. But we're starting a Your Right to Know drive at Common Cause. Hope you all will become part of that to push this along. You do have a right to know who's sponsoring those ads and trying to win your vote. Instead, the commission just seems to be stuck on these other media issues that I've talked about. This one is hard to believe, but we were talking about media ownership and consolidation before. Presently, we have an FCC commission that has been under Democratic control now since 2009. It is considering media ownership rules before and right now that are eerily reminiscent of the proposals that Republican Chairman Kevin Martin and before him Republican Chairman Michael Powell made to loosen newspaper broadcast ownership. Even goes out one better. This new one under the present chairman says let's get rid of any restrictions on radio and television cross ownership too, which I think could be extremely harmful to small diversity stations, especially in big cities who are hanging by a life threat. But that's the issue. Instead of going back and trying to put the brakes on consolidation, instead of trying to figure out how we can get some public interest oversight, some licensing guidelines, for example, on broadcast stations. Instead of doing that, we're going down the same road that big business has wanted the commission to go down for all these years. So we're trying to do something about that too, and put something up on our website. And I think over 200,000 people almost immediately said no to more consolidation and yes to more diversity in the media. But we've got to bring some pressure to bear on that. When candidate Obama, Senator Obama, got into these issues back in 2007, and I have the letters, copies of the letters in my file that he wrote to the commission. He said we shouldn't be changing media ownership rules without first understanding their implication on diversity, groups, minorities, and we ought to be reasserting the public interest. So in my more charitable moments, I'd like to think that even though there were other priorities that may have preoccupied him in the first term, maybe they'll come around in the second term. If a new chairman comes to the FCC, maybe we should be pushing him to that. So we got another little movement we're starting at Common Cause called Promises to Keep, which is unearthing and getting those promises and pledges that were made back in 2007 and in that time period when he was running out. And I think we ought to really highlight them now. We don't know when the present chairman, who is a delightful person, done a lot of good things, but hasn't done much on this diversity or the media thing. We don't know when he's going to be departing. But my point is, when a new chairman is named, before that chairman is confirmed, we ought to have some commitments from him or her. And we ought to have the president on record when he makes that nomination saying, this is the stuff I ran on back when I was running for president, and now it's the time to do this. And you know darn well that as soon as they nominate somebody, they're going to be calling up Common Cause and all the other public interest groups and say, hey, can you get behind our candidate? When they call Common Cause, they will say is, what commitments are you making in return for some support there? So that's promises to keep, and we're going to do that. I should cease and desist here. These are just a couple of the things that we can do. There are many other things. When I say we can do, I say that intentionally because it includes you and me, and it includes making this a grassroots issue. This isn't going to come, I don't think, from the top down or from sudden conversion in Washington or a sudden lessening of opposition by big media and big telecom. It's going to come from the ground up, from the grassroots up. That's why I went to Common Cause when I left the FCC, because it's a grassroots kind of organization where we can come out and we have folks who understand these issues and are willing to take these issues to their local decision makers and powers that be, and elected officials and appointed officials and all the rest. We really need to understand that media is special, that reasserting the public interest in the media is vital to the perpetuation and the nourishment of our civic dialogue, that without a vibrant civic dialogue, none of the problems that I can think of that confront this country are going to be resolved. I could probably go around this room and ask, what's the biggest issue you think is facing the country? And I'd probably get 50 different answers. Well, it's jobs, or lack of competitiveness of the country in rural markets, or 50 million people uninsured with health insurance, or energy dependence, or climate change, or opening the doors of equal opportunity. And those are all very important issues. But if they're going to get resolved, it depends upon how they're presented to the American people. So if you think that issue that's your number one issue is being adequately handled by the media right now, fine. You don't have to listen to me or Common Cause or anything else. But if you think that issue would benefit from a little more factual digging, a little more analysis, a little more diversity of input and diversity of opinion, then you've got to put this media issue right up on par with those other issues. And that's what I mean when I say we're talking about some special enterprise here. We're talking about something that is integral to whether we're going to be able to resolve the problems we face, and that's integral to whether we're going to perpetuate self-government. So you all need to be involved. These problems won't be solved without your involvement. But if we do it right, we can end up still, I think, with a media that informs us, and with a media that's really of, by, and for the American people. So I hope you all will lend a hand. I'll be happy to take any comments, or if we got some time.
Sure.
For
Let's
questions.
We have time for a few questions. Maybe in the back there in the yellow sweater. Go ahead. You?
Right there.
You said that the public financing of campaigns is unlikely to happen, even though that is the basic root cause of where the money in politics. If the public demanded it, it would happen. What do you think would be necessary for the public to demand it?
To really understand the extent of how it's working right now, one of the distortion of democracy that's taking place, and of the extent of the power that we have allowed few to have, to really unearth the fact that money is waging such or exerting such outrageous control in our society. And I don't think it's a partisan issue. I don't think it's one that should divide red state and blue state, or Democrats and Republicans. I've probably been around to 75 or 80 different town meetings, media ownership hearings, localism hearings during my years at the FCC, and everywhere I go, I don't see it as a partisan issue across the country. It's partisan in Washington, D.C., but not there. So I think it's again, media telling the story, holding the powerful accountable. Here are so many abuses we're talking about. Catching ALEC at the beginning of when they wreak their influence, rather than too late to repair the damage that's been done. it's having that civic dialogue that I was talking about, a good exchange of opinion, and I think that's in every American's interest, and it should not be a partisan issue.
In the way back.
Yes, sir. Commissioner Cotton, Bill Clayton. I wanted to tell you I'm just a huge fan. I've been following you since a lot of the independent
Thank you.
media that's given you a voice over the years, like Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman, Bill Moyers, and outlets like that. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how terrestrial radio is kind of morphing now with the internet and broadband and podcasting. And that seems to be in a state of evolution, and whereas the normal radio is going through this, again, process of consolidation. It's most of the major outlets are owned by a few huge companies, but then the ability to, again, bodies just subscribe to certain audio subscriptions, so you can listen, you can choose your own program. And I was wondering how you see that evolving over. It seems to be a huge ongoing thing with podcasting and streaming radio too. Like we only have one progressive radio station in the state.
Well, I think it's something we really need to encourage, and we had a good discussion of this over at Chapel Hill last night, and our mutual friend Jim Goodman was there, and he's somebody that's really thinking about, what is the potential of there's too many people around the country who are saying, well, broadcasting, that's the old dead technology of the past. Now it's broadband. In fact, he was quoting the present chairman of the FCC, who said, well, since I got to the FCC, it's broadband. And I welcome the emphasis on broadband, and I welcome the FCC developing a broadband strategy. But broadcasting is an important player here, not just through the traditional avenues, but through wireless and everything else. And if we're really serious about getting news and information out and getting these technologies out, we'd be thinking about that. There should be, I think, an FM chip, for example, in all the cell phones for public safety purposes, and warning people of imminent danger and all. That's a basic responsibility of government. The safety of the people is the first responsibility and the primary responsibility of government. That should be pretty much of a no-brainer, but you run into some strong industry opposition to that. But we need to be looking at what broadcasting can do, because broadcasting can do some of this stuff a lot more efficiently than broadband can. Jim was using the example, suppose there were 10,000 people in Raleigh that wanted to see last week's 60 Minutes show on TV that they would like to see it at a different time. So suppose those people all go online and try to get that. You're using up a lot of broadband capacity, probably more than exists here right now, just to do that, when in point of fact, if you use some of the broadcasting technologies and wireless combinations, you can get that done more efficiently. So we shouldn't look at it as new technology versus old technology at all. We should be pushing the envelope on broadcast technologies like you're talking about, as well as broadband technologies, because they're both part of the media ecosystem, and we need to look at it in its totality. It's not old media versus new media. This is what we got. We got newspapers. Some of them have disappeared, but newspapers aren't going away. Broadcast is not going away. They're hiring us conflict. We need to fix that, and we need to make this new media work, whether it's broadband or applications of broadcast using some of these new technologies. That's all part of it. That's the ecosystem we live in, and we got to address both parts of it. And we have to be very careful right now. We're into this era of spectrum auctions at the FCC, because clearly there's the thought that wireless needs more spectrum. And that may well be true, and is true, although some of these big wireless companies are sitting on spectrum that they haven't even used yet. My thought is, spectrum belongs to us. If you're not going to use it, give it back, and we'll give it to somebody else who uses it. But if this exercise ends up just being getting spectrum back from big broadcasters to turn it over to a couple of wireless big companies, with no provision for diversity or minority or small business or competitors, that's not serving the public interest at all. So I'm afraid that if that happens, the first candidates who will step up to part with their broadcast licenses and the control of the spectrum they have will be a small diversity station in a big city that's hanging by a life thread. And the other one who will step up will be the hedge fund that owns the station, and what decision they make will be determined by what the little algorithms or logarithms or the little computer tell them. If they can make a penny more by going this way, they'll do it, and a penny more, they go that way. And that's not how you build a communication system that's addressing the needs that I've talked about today.
Didn't you say this morning that a third of our roughly 30% of broadcast stations are now owned by hedge funds?
A third of the large newspaper chains in the country owned by hedge funds.
That's that
And
alone.
a lot of licenses, broadcast licenses, also by private equity funds. And what's their responsibility to preserve and expand the public interest?
A couple more, then we go ahead.
Enjoyed your presentation immensely. What is being done to preemptively achieve some of the concerns that you have relative to the potential new chair of the FCC?
I'm talking about it, and some other groups are talking about it, and I think it's beginning, but I think it's timely. Nobody knows when the current chair will leave. It might be a month, it might be 6 months, I don't know. Maybe you're staying on longer than that. That's not the expectation, but I think the public interest community in Washington and many others around the country have decided now that the next candidate to merit their support is going to have to be a little bit more forthcoming on public interest problems as they apply to media that we've talked about here today and protecting the public interest generally. So is that a great national groundswell? No, but we're trying to start it. You need to get decision makers' attention on we who live in FCC world always think, well, this is kind of the center of the universe, but in point of fact, the President of the United States has got cabinet secretaries to name, deputy secretaries, slots on the field, undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, ambassadors, this, that, and the other thing. So whether the FCC is even on his radar screen as you and I are talking, I don't really know. But by the time he gets to where he's going to step into the Rose Garden and announce a new chairperson, I think we have to make sure that the White House knows and that he knows that expectations are a little bit higher than they have been.
Last question. Yeah. Great. Yeah.
I read the Nation piece, both in the Nation and here, and you quote the stipulation, the FCC stipulation that they must fully and fairly disclose true identity of person or persons or corporation, committee, association, or other unincorporated group or other entity paying for them. Why is that not a barn door for the Koch brothers and whoever to continue to walk through with impunity? I mean, how can utilizing that particular stipulation do us any good?
This is just something that we can do now. It's not presented as a cure-all for the problem of money in politics. There will never be a silver bullet or a cure-all for money in politics. You plug one hole in the dike and money's always going to find the other crack somewhere. So the next year, and the year after that, and the year after that, you do that. I'm just saying this is something we can do now that will bring disclosure so that people have a better understanding of who's trying to persuade them, and hopefully that will have some happy consequences in how they make up their mind about is that ad really correct or not? Ooh, look who's supporting it. So I think it would. I think shining the light of public attention on that would help. I don't present it as a cure-all. We have to find ways to rein in the role of money, but trying to do that in the current political climate is very difficult. We have to find ways to go about determining congressional districts and gerrymandering, which that's a huge, huge problem. We have to find a resolution to the 60-vote threshold in the Senate to get anything done. Those are all huge problems. Those are three of the biggest problems facing our country right now. But I want to submit that I think right up there and perhaps surpassing them is the role of the media that I talked about. Those would be the big four. Do something about the media, do something about the money, do something about the gerrymandering, do something about the deadlock in the Senate. And if we can make progress on those four, all of which Common Cause and some of the other public groups are involved in, it'd be a happier and better country.
But join me again in thanking Mr. Consolidation.